welcome to week 9 in this course on MLOps. In this week, we're going to take a look at model governance. And this is an interesting topic only because most of you will end up working in companies, startups, as well as maybe even government or academic institutions in the future, all of whom would get regulated heavily by both the governments of the day as well as a broader industry consortium. That's the full belief I have. And the reason for that is uh, today AI looks like a wild, wild west kind of a scenario where everybody lays claim on the latest and greatest of innovations. But already there are repercussions for adoption of AI at large scale to the extent that, especially with the coverage by popular media, there has been significant backlash as well. And this has resulted in conversations across multiple important hallways, including the power corridors of the government, of international bodies, etc. And there is active, regulation either already on the way or being contemplated in the higher legislative courts in many countries. And so it's within a couple of years, in my view, that almost all of applied machine learning is going to get regulated. So it's a emerging field. There is a lot of work that's happening here, and there is a lot of work that has already manifested in various, various ways, various tools, techniques, methods, best practices. So I hope to cover some of that here. The caveat emptor across all of the machine learning based lectures that we have done is that the scenario on the ground evolves rapidly, and that's especially true for governance as well. But the fundamental techniques or considerations, I hope, would stay the test of time. So, model governance stems from having strong ethics grounding the entire use of machine learning in a particular system. And the role of governance here is to provide oversight of these systems that go beyond accuracy. The key word is beyond accuracy because that's pretty much the only objective function that most data scientists are known to optimize for. So the moment you have to now think about other facets of machine learning applications, it becomes unfathomable. In fact, at times we have seen that to continue to provide ethics around machine learning decision making, machine learning driven decision making, at times you'll have to sacrifice accuracy as well. And that's a pretty strong call to make, and not usually something that the data scientist by himself or herself is able to make. But at the least, it's a topic of conversation that involves higher management and requires their buy-in. In a modern enterprise setting like a bank or a telecom company, usually there is a data owner, like a chief data officer or some such title, and they are in turn tasked with ensuring that governance and regulatory compliance are taken care of. And so at their level, usually these kinds of trade-offs happen between accuracy and other matrices. What are the other matrices? So there are, another way to say it is, what are the principles, core principles underlining ethics associated with ML-driven systems? Fairness is one of the most important ones. We will take a detailed look at each of these in the next few slides. Privacy, as it pertains to individual users, consumers. Transparency in the decisions that get taken by machine learning models. And finally, accountability, because at the end of the day, it should not be the case that automation has resulted in a significant decision to which nobody in the organization is signed up for. It should always be under the ambit of a person that is responsible for certain decisions, and the accountability for automation using ML stops with him or her. Governance of models is exactly what we just spoke about, but usually this stems from governance of the broader landscape in which the particular company or industry is operating under. and that's often driven by regulation and the current law of the land. And therefore, this is an emerging topic. There's a lot of work that needs to happen as the regulations or laws change. So, why govern models in the first place? I think the quick and dirty answer is that models don't exist in vacuum. They exist in the context of operational processes, business processes, and those businesses in turn exist in the context of supply and demand, in the context of consumers wanting to consume something. So the moment it touches people, there is a need to understand how can damage be prevented from going beyond a small minimal kind of a boundary, or how can risks be minimized when people consume certain things, how can people's interests be protected, etc. So regulation comes from fundamentally these human driven facets of modern society. So models being part and parcel of these real world systems effectively mean that they also are subject to the same type of governance. So regulations pertaining to data are plenty today. In fact, one of the most effective pieces of regulation is something called as GDPR. We will take a detailed look at it in a couple of slides. Um, like GDPR, there are other countries like Singapore which have also enacted pretty mature pieces of legislation. In Singapore, it's called as PDPA. Um, and then India has its version of it as well. It's called DPDPA, and there are variations, there are nuances to how each country perceives these regulations. So we will take a look at that. So fundamentally, regulations govern people and their data, and therefore ML models being driven fundamentally by data are also governed by the same regulations. The second reason why governance is really important is there are use cases which are fundamentally high risk, um, and these use cases have potentially significant impact for impact on humans. So think of healthcare as an example. So the more recently there has been this AI model, or in fact I should say a bake-off between AI models that was conducted in India. um, Early 2025 is when the results kind of came in, and the model, or rather the set of models that were chosen, were meant to help in identifying tuberculosis in patients using just their x-rays. So you can imagine the cost of getting a decision wrong in this scenario. um, for instance, if you have false negatives as a model developer, then you could potentially be declaring a tuberculosis infected patient as somebody who's not infected, and therefore he or she will not be subjected to the treatment regime, and that might be proving fatal in the long run. So these are examples of high risk use cases. Finance, of course, is a pretty significant function because credit is what drives most of the economy. So if you, for instance, deny credit to needy individuals, and then the nature of the decision for denying the credit is suspect or is not sound, then that has a significant collateral impact on other facets of the individual and potentially the economy as well. So these kinds of high risk use cases necessarily mean that the respective sectoral regulator, RBI in the case of finance as an example, has a stake in the ground for ensuring that the right thing happens as far as the end consumer goes. And then the last aspect of it is a reason I hope every corporate or startup or institution, irrespective of whether they're being regulated by the government or regulatory industry bodies or not, themselves have to follow, which is the fact that oftentimes feedback loops do go wrong. And we've seen this in many ways, in many cases, across decades of computerized systems. The same is true with machine learning driven systems as well. So many steps involved in in the final production of a machine learning model that goes into live deployments. And at any point in time, these steps can be uh, done in a way that's suboptimal, and that's to say the least. But in the worst case, it could be done in a way that's actively harmful. So, how do you protect against that is something that every company which is using ML models should be looking at, irrespective of whether they're getting regulated or not, in my view. Okay, so these three reasons why governance is important. Let's take a look at specifically the role of regulation, because a lot of decision making on how to use ML and when to use ML is going to be driven by regulation. And why bother with regulatory compliance? Obviously, the biggest reason is that it results in heavy penalties if the compliance is missing. Even if it's partially missing or completely missing, it doesn't matter. Penalties are varied, penalties are subjective, and in a lot of ways, penalties can be detrimental to the very existence of the company. So let's take a look at the perspective of regulation first, and then we'll take a look at the other uh, reasons, including how feedback loops can go wrong. So GDPR was one of the earliest pieces of regulation that was, in my view, one of the more mature articulations of how data in the wrong hands can be used for wrong things. So it stands for General Data Protection Regulation. It's a regulation that applies in the European Union, the EU zone. It governs how personal data is collected, processed, and then stored. So, as you can imagine, these three facets of how data works, like storage, processing, collection, pretty much covers how um, data lifecycle is managed. So the interesting part about GDPR is that while it restricts itself to the citizens of the EU, it actually applies to any company or service which provides goods or services to the citizens of EU. It could be a company in India also, for instance. So what are the core principles of GDPR? First and foremost, the systems need to be lawful, fairness. I mean, have fairness in it and be transparent. So users of that system. So I'm going to, let's say, for instance, take a running example of a media company, um, something like Hotstar or something like ESPN, Cricinfo, or any of these various content providers. Let's assume, for instance, that this is content that's operating from India, um, and then it's being given to or provided to the citizens of the EU, um, and therefore, as part of which the content usage, the data around the um, tracking of which user does what, etc., is all being potentially captured by the system. So, in this first core principle, anybody who accesses the content should also know in what ways um, the content provider is going to be using the data that's being collected on behalf of that user, right? So that usage has to be fairly well understood and transparently stated. The second part is purpose limitation. So this core principle, declares that data that's collected is only meant for a specific purpose. So let's say, for instance, that um, the content provider is interested in marketing new content based on existing content that's being viewed. Like people who like these videos also like these other videos. That's a purpose which is something that needs to be stated upfront to the user to say, look, we need data collection from you. Do you agree? And we will use your data for marketing other videos. So that's a very targeted way in which the data has to be collected with full transparency on what the purpose is. And the third, the core principle, which is the counterpart principle, is data minimization, which means use only as little data as necessary for a particular service to happen. So let's say in this case, the user signed up for being advertised to by recommendations of other videos that could be of interest. Then the data that's required for it is only the data that is pertaining to the watch history or the click history or the search history. It is not, for instance, it does not require data about the individual, where they live, the address, the age, the phone number, the email address, etc. Right? Because those are very sensitive pieces of data, and that has no individual bearing on recommendation engines which are more aggregate learning mechanisms. So that's an example of data minimization. Accuracy goes without saying. So we need to be able to say that the data that's collected genuinely belongs to that particular user, and I'm not mixing up data sets as you know due to mistakes or errors or whatever. Then there is also a storage limitation clause in it, which pertains to the fact that the maximum period of storage for data is only for that particular service for which that data needs to be stored. So, for instance, if you're building a recommendation engine, let's assume that the recommendation engine refreshes once a month, then the patterns associated with the watch history, the search history, click history of videos need not be stored for beyond, let's say, a month or maybe a little more than a month, because the behavior has already been captured in the previous iteration of the recommendation engine. So the most recent set of data, which is just the last 1 month plus of data, needs to be looked at, and therefore only that needs to be stored. Especially, you don't need, like for instance, a year-long history for an individual when the engine has already captured the details of it. So that's storage limitation. And this is especially applicable to personal data, which means the data of what one individual did with the videos specifically. So that's personal data. Integrity and confidentiality of every single data set is absolutely essential. So it's strong privacy concerns which have to be addressed. Strong security mechanisms have to be put in place to address them. And you should also be in a position to tell the user that I've got all of your data stored in one place without leakage, without sensitive information being leaked or revealed to others who are not part and parcel of the system. And last but not the least, everything must be provable. And that's like a true definition of accountability that they have adopted. So which means that it's not enough to state by declaring in a piece of a document that, hey, I've done all of these 6 things, but you've got to be able to prove that I've met these requirements, right? And the proof usually involves automation. It's not humans looking at data sets and saying, hey, yes, I've ensured data minimization, etc., etc. So if you then put all of this together, it's a pretty comprehensive set of constraints that are imposed on data systems, definitely therefore on ML systems, because ML systems are fundamentally data driven. There is the counterpart view that GDPR also goes at length about, right? Because the core principles that we just spoke about drive evolution of systems, but the motivation for these core principles come from, again, protection of end user interests. So in this case, the end users are the ones who are sharing data about themselves. So they're also referred to as data principals or data subjects. So these data principles are envisaged to have rights as it pertains to data. So think of it as fundamental rights that are enshrined in the Constitution of India. Along those lines, I wouldn't say at the same level of legality, but along those lines, you've got now rights that are enshrined about every single data principle in GDPR. So what are these rights? And the reason why these rights are important is a lot of the same kind of a language is actually making its way into the Indian regulations as well. And we will take a look at the comparison and contrasting in a couple of slides. The other very interesting choice of, the other very interesting observation is the choice of the word right. So the notion of data as being an asset that needs to be secured is something that many companies have known for quite some time, right? The interesting notion here is data as it emanates from an individual is part and parcel of that individual, is part and parcel of that person's individuality, of that person's very being. And therefore, just like the rest of the being, which is, for instance, the bodily functions, leading a life, earning a livelihood, having rights pertaining to family, to freedom, liberty, etc. All of those are, very much enshrined in most democratic countries. The data emanation, which is the data being generated by that individual, is also being subjected to rights, which the data principal can enforce or demand enforcement of. So one of the first things is, one of the first rights is right to access. So here the question that any data principal can ask a company that's operating on this data is, what data do you have about me? So the user can turn around to the content provider in India and say, and ask this question and expect an answer within a reasonable time. Right to rectification is the corresponding sub-right. That's a way to think about it. Is once you know what data is there about me, I want to know, rather I want to make some corrections on that. So the corrections can be because most times data is not collected explicitly; it's collected implicitly. So example being, if there is a form that asks me to fill my details, I fill it and I make a mistake, then that's my problem. I can come back and correct it. That's fine. That's the normal scenario. But let's say that data is collected about me and there are certain things which are being inferred. Like one of the things that's being inferred is my gender. I've not revealed it explicitly in a form, but it's being inferred based on various activities that have happened. As part of the right of access, the company is obligated to share with the data principal that, look, we have collected all this data, including data about uh, behaviors that lead to the inference of gender. And then I can take a look at it and say that, look, you have computed my gender as female. That's actually wrong. I am a male. And that's a significant step to take, because implicit data changes are much harder to track and much harder to prove in a normal company setting, right? So to be able to say that's the data that's there and have it be corrected is a significant step. Now notice that this has direct implications on ML, because ML-driven systems fundamentally are inferring new forms of behavior and then adding to the corpus of data that's being known about that individual. Okay, right to erasure is the corresponding sub-right again, is a right to be forgotten, is for the individual to say, look, I don't need your service anymore, delete all my data, which is a really, really powerful thing to say. Think about it. If I've got data sitting across multiple files, years and years of usage of the service of this particular content provider has resulted in years of data collection. And at some point, the user says that, look, I want to delete my account, so please forget all my data. To be able to go back to every single one of those data points that uniquely link usage to that individual across those years, delete it, prove that you have deleted it, and then get back with a confirmation is a significant hassle for most technology companies. And the reason, one of the biggest reasons, is that data is actually spread across multiple places. Data is actually, sitting in multiple databases, sitting in cloud storages, sometimes sitting in tapes, etc., etc. How do you prove? So that's a very significant, uh, cost associated with this. The fourth right is right to restrict processing, and this is the corresponding right to data minimization principle, which is that I want you as a data principal, I want you to only process the data that's minimally required in order to provide the service that I have agreed to sign up with you for, right? So that's the right to restrict processing. Right to data portability means that when I do want a copy of the data that you've given, that you've collected about me, I want it in a way that I can understand, which means it needs to be portable onto a different machine without requiring expensive proprietary software that only you have or few people have access to. Significant, again, right. Right to object. So here, especially since the advent of the GDPR regulations came from the abuse of internet-driven advertising, the right to object became a significant right in and of itself. which is the ability for the data principal to object to being advertised to, being marketed to, or being profiled across websites. In fact, profiling across websites is a significant way in which e-commerce companies make money. Google makes money, right? Facebook makes money. For instance, every time you've gone to your browser on your laptop, which has all the different accounts logged in, right? Facebook logged in, Meta logged in, Instagram logged in, WhatsApp logged in, Google logged in, etc. So every time you've gone to that browser and then searched for Reebok shoes, you might find over the next couple of days Reebok shoes popping up as an advertisement across multiple different third-party websites, not even on Google or Amazon where you searched, right? It could be now coming up in news portals, uh, in YouTube, in media companies, in sports centers, etc., etc. And the reason why that happens is because of a specific advertising technique called as retargeting, and those are based on cookies. At times they're based on accounts, at times they're based on individually identifiable information. So these kinds of information are usually shared by these third party companies with their affiliates, and when that sharing happens, the sharing is pretty individually identifiable. Maybe they don't share your exact names or account sensitive information, but they share enough to be able to do retargeting, which includes even cookies, machine identification, data sets, etc. So, right to object is a way for the data principal to say, I don't want to be profiled, including like retargeting based mechanisms anymore. Significant. Last but not the least, right not to be subjected to automated decision making. This really hits the nail on ML usage directly. So, if I am a content provider and that content provider uses recommendation engines for suggesting new videos, the data principals can turn around and individuals can say, I don't want to be, recommended content by automation, by recommendation engines. Then the product in which the ML is embedded, the recommendation engine is embedded, has to service that use case, has to service that particular right of that particular individual not to be targeted by recommendation engines. So, significant cost of compliance when it comes to these rights as fundamental rights which are enshrined within GDPR about data principles. So, what are some of the implications and consequences for ML driven systems? So, first and foremost, data collection. So, think of it as training data which is used in ML has to be collected with full user consent, and it has to be purpose driven, obviously, but fundamentally it's about consent. If the user is not consenting, then data collection is actually illegal. So that's point number one. The second point is uh, models have to be explainable, because provability or accountability comes from being able to say that certain things are happening the way they're supposed to happen. So explainable models is a significant uh, implication of this GDPR regulations. The third is you've got to be able to have models adapt to newer data sets, to newer preferences, right? As these rights evolve, as these core principles get exercised, right? And that comes down to this activity called as drift retraining. So drift happens all the time. We'll take a look at why some of the reasons, or what are some of the reasons for drift. So that retraining has to happen, but at the same time, whenever that retraining happens, you cannot rely on newer data sets which are not absolutely minimally required for providing the user the service. So that balance has to be um, met by siding on the on the side of the regulations here. So that's the third implication, and then the fourth implication is the fact that you've got to have lineage and audit logs for everything. Otherwise, provability becomes really hard. The penalties are what make it very interesting, and in fact, this is, I think, one of the most significant ways in which it's different from the Indian regulations, apart from a bunch of other principles as well. For GDPR compliance, um, the regulations say that for any non-compliance, partial or full, there are penalties applicable to the tune of 20 million euros at the maximum side, or 4% of global annual revenue, whichever is higher. Notice the word global. In fact, this has been a significant bone of contention for many companies which have been fined in the past, because the revenue for a multinational company pertains to revenue that comes from other citizens as well, not just EU citizens. So, how is it fair that EU uh, penalizes such companies for non-compliance based on their global revenue? The counterpoint is that provability of revenue from specific set of citizen-based services is something that's not easy. So, if the company can actually prove, maybe there is a chance, but in most cases you can't. So then global revenue becomes like the maximal ceiling which dictates how much the penalties can be. So let's contrast this with India's version. It's called as Digital Personal Data Protection Act 2023, or DPDPA in short. So the scope for, by the way, GDPR came in 2018, and that's when it fully went into law. But the early indications of GDPR, draft regulations, all of them were shared at least a couple of years onwards from there. So the scope for GDPR applies, like I said, to all EU citizens, especially personal data pertaining to the EU citizens. Whereas the Indian regulation speaks about it in the context of digital data, digital personal data. So this distinction is key because it doesn't pertain to hand data or offline data sets which have been recorded or stored for individuals. In the Indian environment, this is a significant distinction because most services which are affecting our daily lives are still not digitized. Like, for instance, local government services, local municipal body services, etc., etc. The good part is digitization is catching up with almost all these services. So eventually, these data sets will also be under the purview. Is there any extraterritorial reach? For GDPR, yes. For DPDPA, also yes, if these goods and services are being provided to Indians. So in that sense, it's common for both the laws. What's the legal basis for data processing? Consent is the fundamental metric for legal for data processing in the Indian context. Whereas in GDPR, there are various other facets as well, like we spoke about the rights of the individual, etc. So and there are other legitimate uses as well, like law enforcement, which are always exceptions in most of these regulations. That's applicable for the Indian law context as well. What are the rights of data principals? Broadly the same across both these regulations. Is there a right to be forgotten? That's something that needs to be called out explicitly because that's one of the most crucial rights. In DPDPA, while the language is included, the implementation or the expected implementation is unclear, whereas GDPR is unequivocal about it. What about the ability to use data for profiling or AI-driven automated decisions? GDPR restricts it. In DPDPA, there is no such restriction. In fact, neither is it explicitly addressed as well. So it's left to maybe subsequent iterations of the law in the future. This is as of summer to 2025, I should say that. Data Protection Authority definitely exists. In the case of GDPR, it's called EDPP, European Union Data Protection Board, I believe. Independent, it's well resourced. I mean, it's what goes after these companies for penalties, etc. In DPDPA, there is one such board which has been proposed or envisaged. It's called the Data Protection Board of India, but it's yet to be operationalized, even though it's been little more than 15-16 months since the law has been enacted. The penalties are, in Indian context, it's up to 250 crores, but there are, details which have to be worked out. Children's data, because those are special classes of citizens and subject to even more restrictions because of the sensitive nature of their lives and livelihoods. So there are special consent and protections available for it in GDPR. In DPDPA, there's a blanket parental consent clause, which is applicable for all children's data as well. Data localization requirements in EU, that's not the case. Data can flow globally, but all the rights, provability, all of that applies wherever the data is residing. In the Indian context, cross-border flows are allowed, but usually for different sectors, there are localization restrictions as well. Like for instance, in the financial services sector, RBI has mandated that even if you use cross-border flows of data, there has to be a local copy available for regulatory purposes. For certain sectors, there are also blacklisted constraints or countries uh, which are forbidden from ever seeing Indian data sets. And then, if there is a breach of any of these core principles or constraints, in GDPR's case, within 72 hours, we're supposed to let the board know. In the Indian context, it's left as soon as possible, so it's less specific. Okay, so I'm going to take a pause here. In the next video, we'll take a look at some of the glaring examples of governance failures.